Here is Tag Kyo no Oto Keshimurasaki. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. A soft blue, possibly a soft blue-black, that despite its soft tone is generally easy to read on the page. It just isn't screaming your words back at you. I do see some tone variation as the papers change, and in some of the off-camera testing, there is some tone variation by pen. It does shade generally well, and regardless of pen or paper. Now, on non-fountain pen friendly paper, it maintains its solid performance, where its worst case has it still being very usable. Like so many inks, this falls into the category of happy to have used it. Another sample in the future would be good, but I don't see going for a bottle of it. The pen for today is a Platinum 3776. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. We get a very nice, lighter kind of blue tone with no feather, no spread. We do see some pretty decent shading going on. When you look at the Ravens, the is quite a bit darker than Ravens, and even most of Ravens is fairly light, with that N being quite a bit darker. Brought next to that, the B shows a couple of different tones where the R gets quite a bit darker. It lightens up a lot with the OUGH, very dark with the T at the end. Looking at the back of the page with the wiggling fingers between them, no bleeding, no ghosting, and no problems. Let's take a look at some other inks from the same manufacturer. Here is Tag Kyo no Oto Adzuki Iro. Here is Tag Kyo no Oto Hisoku. Here is Tag Kyo no Oto Here is Tag Kyo no Oto Maeglo Iro. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Here it is, slightly darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. I think it's coming through a bit better here, probably because of the more absorbent nature of this paper. Now, it doesn't feather and it doesn't spread. It does show quite a bit of shading that is fairly good, though it's not like it ever becomes super dark. If you take a look at 2 and Days on the first line, the bottom of the T is quite a bit darker than the top of the T. The WO become a nice midtone. Now, Days starts a little bit lighter at the beginning of the D, gets quite darker at the downstroke of the D into the AY, lightening a little bit into that S at the end. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook. We get a sort of slight greenish lean going on here, which is probably because the ink is a little bit more translucent, showing it's affected by the tone of the paper that you're going to use. Now, it doesn't feather and it doesn't spread. It does shade better than it has on any of the papers we've seen before, and if you look like unremarkable on the first line, mostly one tone, Fear underneath that starts quite a bit darker with the F, lightens up through the EA, and then becomes darker again at the R at the end. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook. First thing we always have to take a look at here now will be on the quad rule. I don't think this is dark enough to really stand out on a quad rule in any kind of positive way, meaning if quad rule is really what you go for, this might not be a good ink for you. Though its tone is the same as it was on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather and it doesn't spread. It does shade just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, so the shading's there, just not huge, screaming constantly, take a look at host on the second line, where the H and T at the ends are both darker than the OS in the middle. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Ackerman, their 00 Royal Ackerman Blue. Here is Omos Blue.
Here is a blue ink by Organic Studios Accident.
Here is Papier Plume Peacock.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook. It still has some trouble standing out against the quad rule, not making it a good pick on this paper. Now, it's slightly flatter as a tone, but generally just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather and it doesn't spread. It does shade when you take a look at hastening on the first line, where the H is quite a bit darker than it is through most of the rest of the word until you come to the N, that it darkens up quite a bit. Fed underneath that, the bottom of the F is darker than the top of the F. It maintains a lighter tone through the ED, but the downstroke of that D gets darker again. While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Sailor Mother Pink. Here is Noodler's Operation Overlord. Here is Diatramentis Magenta Red Bronze. Here is Pen BBS number 184.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. We get pretty much the same tone that we got with the Clairfontaine, though it does feather quite a bit. It does spread quite a bit. It does shade just as well as it did really on any of the other papers. It's the feathering and the spreading that make you say, can you use it? I think it falls in the realm for most people that it would be perfectly fine. The feathering for me, though, is just a bit distracting. So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? I have to point out most notably that the tone that you're going to see here does change a little bit and become a little bit more of that green lean again because of its more translucent nature. Now, I found this from a dry writing soft fine to be just a bit light, and though not too light, but a tiny bit darker would be better. So I would avoid a dry pen in a fine or medium. In the off-camera testing, I used a wet medium and it darkened significantly and was much more usable. It was the wet medium that really got this ink to stand out much better. So for this, I would recommend a slightly wet pen of any nib size. I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.